In Kyiv, a startling announcement has captured global attention. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy revealed that his government is preparing a new wave of sanctions, this time publicly targeting individuals and entities from China for the first time. The move has ignited intense international debate, not because of the sanctions themselves, but because of the chosen target. Instead of focusing exclusively on Russia, its direct adversary on the battlefield, Kyiv has shifted its focus to China, global power that has consistently maintained a posture of neutrality in the conflict. Beijing's response was swift and unequivocal, rejecting what it termed unilateral sanctions and urging Ukraine to correct its mistaken actions, further intensifying the diplomatic friction. China's sudden inclusion in this diplomatic crossfire has raised immediate and pressing questions across the international community. Some observers speculate that Kyiv, facing a grueling war of attrition, where direct measures against Moscow have not yielded a decisive breakthrough, is deliberately widening the scope of its economic pressure. Others interpret the move as a stark warning to nations claiming neutrality, signaling that geographical distance from the brutal fighting does not grant immunity from scrutiny. The core of the matter seems to be a redefinition of involvement, one that extends far beyond the front lines and into the complex networks of global commerce. On the surface, President Zelensky's declaration marks a significant and rare escalation on the diplomatic front. China has not entered the war, has not publicly supplied lethal weapons to Russia, and has not been formally designated by Western governments as a military backer of Moscow. However, Ukraine's decision to name Chinese individuals and companies allegedly connected to Russia's military-industrial complex suggests a far broader interpretation of responsibility. This new framework appears to extend beyond the trenches and shell-pocked cities, reaching into the economic and logistical supply chains that sustain a war machine. It implies that in a modern, interconnected conflict, the line between bystander and enabler is becoming increasingly blurred. Many analysts contend that China's inclusion in Ukraine's sanctions list is less about overt military actions and more about its quiet yet substantial role in propping up Russia's economy since 2022. As Moscow's trade with the West collapsed under a mountain of sanctions, China emerged as its most critical economic lifeline. The flow of electronic components, industrial machinery, so-called loose goods systems with both civilian and military applications, widely believed to have been instrumental in helping Russia sustain its industrial production and war-making capacity. These goods, while not weapons themselves, are the building blocks of modern military hardware, from drones to advanced missile systems. This gray zone activity makes China's role exceptionally difficult to dismiss, yet equally challenging to define with conclusive evidence. From Kyiv's perspective, Beijing does not need to send tanks or soldiers to exert a meaningful influence on the conflict's trajectory. Its economic support is seen as a critical logistical link in Russia's war effort. Some observers believe Ukraine now views Beijing as a pivotal node in this supply network, making indirect pressure a potentially effective strategy. By targeting this economic relationship, Ukraine may be attempting to weaken its adversary without confronting it head-on, opening a new front in a war that has increasingly become a test of industrial and economic endurance. Compared to the strategy of piling more sanctions on Moscow, adversary already hardened and adapted to years of economic pressure, directing attention toward Russia's key economic partners may represent a calculated shift in tactics. This approach could be particularly potent when those partners, like China, maintain deep and intricate economic ties with Western markets. The potential for leverage is significant, as the threat of secondary sanctions or reputational damage could compel Chinese firms to reconsider their dealings with Russia. Nevertheless, analysts remain sharply divided on whether this strategy can realistically prompt a change in Beijing's behavior, or if it risks further isolating Ukraine and complicating its already precarious diplomatic position on the world stage. As the conflict stretches on, its repercussions have become increasingly globalized, forcing a re-examination of what it means to be neutral. The ambiguity between non-involvement and indirect support appears to lie at the heart of Ukraine's latest pressure campaign. By publicly naming Chinese individuals and entities, Kyiv has forced a debate that extends beyond the specific targets. It raises fundamental questions about the strategic motivations behind the decision and whether this signals a new phase in how Ukraine prosecutes the war, moving from the battlefield to the boardroom and the factory floor. The message is clear. In this conflict, there is no longer a safe harbor for those who enable the aggressor. Many observers believe this move reflects a careful recalibration of strategy rather than an impulsive, emotional reaction. With the war having settled into a brutal stalemate and decisive military breakthroughs becoming increasingly difficult and costly to achieve, Ukraine may be seeking to expand the fronts of pressure through economic and logistical channels. From this vantage point, China is not the ultimate target, but a crucial link in the supply chains that help sustain Russia's industrial resilience. The logic is that if the flow of critical components, advanced machinery, and dual-use goods can be disrupted or restricted, Russia's ability to wage a protracted war could be gradually but persistently eroded. Publicly naming Chinese companies and individuals also serves as a broader, more powerful message to other third-party nations and corporations. The gray zone of plausible deniability is no longer a sanctuary. Even without direct participation in the carnage, actors perceived as enabling Russia's war effort could find themselves exposed to severe reputational, legal, and economic consequences. This strategy aims to create a chilling effect, forcing companies and countries to conduct more rigorous due diligence and weigh the risks of being associated with a war that has caused immense human suffering and devastation. It is an attempt to weaponize transparency and accountability on a global scale. Another interpretation of Ukraine's move emphasizes the diplomatic dimension. Some analysts suggest that Kyiv is deliberately placing China in a more uncomfortable and exposed position, compelling Beijing to add substance to its repeated claims of neutrality. As China continues to promote its own peace initiatives while simultaneously deepening its economic partnership with Russia, this dual-track approach is coming under intense international scrutiny. The inherent contradiction between playing the role of a peacemaker and acting as the primary economic buttress for one of the belligerents has not gone unnoticed. From this angle, Ukraine's threat of sanctions may be a calculated diplomatic gambit designed to force Beijing's hand. It pressures China to make a difficult choice, either tighten its oversight of Chinese companies and citizens to prevent them from aiding Russia's war machine, or risk being increasingly associated with the brutal consequences of the conflict. A more nuanced hypothesis suggests that Ukraine is maneuvering strategically at a time when rapid military gains on the battlefield are unlikely. By applying pressure to Russia's most important strategic partner, Kyiv could be attempting to open new avenues of influence and leverage, creating diplomatic pressure points far from the front lines. However, this bold strategy is fraught with considerable risks. Directly confronting another major global power could strain Kyiv's diplomatic capacity and potentially lead to unforeseen and unmanageable fallout. China's response is therefore being watched with intense scrutiny across the globe. So far, Beijing has firmly rejected the accusations, reiterating its long-standing position that it does not provide lethal weapons to either side and reaffirming its support for a political resolution to the conflict. This carefully worded stance is designed to serve multiple objectives simultaneously. Analysts note that Beijing's response aims to protect Chinese companies and citizens from what it views as unjust and unilateral punishment. It also seeks to guard against a precedent that could undermine China's core foreign policy principles, particularly its emphasis on state sovereignty and its opposition to sanctions that lack the endorsement of the United Nations Security Council. From Beijing's perspective, unilateral sanctions imposed by a single country, especially a non-Western one, set a deeply uncomfortable and potentially destabilizing example that could one day be used against China itself. At the same time, China has been careful to avoid escalating the situation. It continues to position itself as a potential mediator, emphasizing its peace initiatives while skillfully avoiding a direct confrontation with either Ukraine or its Western partners. Observers see this as a familiar and finely tuned balancing act, projecting firmness to defend its national interests and economic actors, while exercising enough restraint to avoid being drawn deeper into a conflict it has no desire to fight. All of this leads to a broader, more fundamental question. Will Ukraine's planned sanctions meaningfully alter China's behavior? Or will they merely add new layers of complexity to an already tangled and volatile diplomatic landscape? Looking back, Some analysts argued that Ukraine's increasingly assertive stance toward China did not materialize overnight. It is the culmination of a series of decisions that demonstrate Kyiv's willingness to prioritize national security over economic interests. A notable example occurred in 2021, before the full-scale escalation of the war. When the Ukrainian government blocked a Chinese acquisition of a key defense sector company, Motorsich, citing national security concerns, subsequent moves to label certain Chinese firms as international sponsors of war further reinforced the perception that Ukraine is prepared to broaden its toolkit of pressure beyond the immediate belligerent. On a wider level, the expansion of sanctions to include third parties is blurring the very boundaries of the conflict itself. What began as a bilateral war, confined to the fields and cities of Ukraine, is increasingly intertwined with larger geopolitical tests of the international order. It has become a stress test for alliances, global supply chains, and the very definition of neutrality in the 21st century. The key questions remain unresolved. Is Ukraine actively reshaping the rules of engagement in modern warfare, or is it reacting out of desperation under the immense pressure of a protracted and brutal conflict? And ultimately, will targeting China succeed in weakening Russia war? Will it simply open new fault lines in an already fractured and complex global confrontation?